Did you know that nearly 1 in 3 people around the world have lived under some form of communism in the last century? That's over 2 billion people who've experienced it firsthand. But what about socialism? Countries like Sweden and Denmark have been living with socialist policies for decades, and they're often ranked as some of the happiest nations on earth. So, what's the real difference between communism and socialism? Are they just two words for the same thing, or do they represent completely different ideas? While both promise equality and a fairer society, their strategies could not be more different. In this video, we'll break it all down for you. You'll discover how communism led to brutal dictatorships in countries like the Soviet Union, while socialist countries like Norway have found a balance between freedom and equality. We'll dive into real-world examples, shocking facts, and explore how these ideologies have shaped the world we live in today. Stick with us as we unravel the mystery behind communism versus socialism. Chapter 1: The Red Divide. Understanding the ideological rift. Communism and socialism are often thrown around in political discussions, but many don't fully grasp the differences. Both ideologies stem from a desire for equality, but their approaches are vastly different. Simply put, communism aims for a classless, stateless society where everything is owned by the community, while socialism seeks to reduce inequality within the framework of a state-run economy. Communism's core idea was first laid out by Karl Marx in the 19th century. Marx believed that capitalism, which thrives on private ownership, would eventually collapse under its own contradictions. This collapse would lead to the rise of a working-class revolution. Marx argued that workers should own the means of production, not private capitalists. This, in theory, would end exploitation and class divisions. Socialism, on the other hand, doesn't call for the complete abolition of capitalism. It seeks to make it more fair by focusing on wealth redistribution and social programs. In the early 20th century, thinkers like Edward Bernstein argued that socialism could evolve through democratic means instead of through violent revolution. This is why many socialist systems are democratic, such as those seen in Sweden and Norway. In practice, these ideologies have looked very different. Socialism often works with existing capitalist structures, adding layers of regulation and social welfare. Communism, however, aims for a total overhaul of society, even in ways that can be brutal. The Soviet Union, for example, implemented forced collectivization and purges to achieve its communist goals. The biggest difference lies in their approach to government. In a communist system, the state has absolute control, at least until it eventually withered away, as Marx predicted. Socialism, though, can work within democratic frameworks where the government's power is often limited and accountable to the people. Chapter 2: From Marx to Lenin, the Communist Vision. The communist vision is radical and uncompromising. Marx's theory is all about revolution. He argued that history is driven by class struggle. In capitalist societies, the working class, proletariat, is oppressed by the owning class, bourgeoisie. Marx believed that the workers would rise up, overthrow the bourgeoisie, and establish a dictatorship of the proletariat. Lenin, the leader of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, took Marx's theory and turned it into a blueprint for revolution. Lenin didn't wait for the inevitable collapse of capitalism. Instead, he called for immediate action. He believed a small, disciplined party of revolutionaries should lead the charge. This meant that communism in practice wasn't going to be a gradual transition, it was a sudden, violent change. Under Lenin, the Soviet Union was born. It was a state where the government controlled all aspects of life, including the economy, culture, and even the personal lives of its citizens. Lenin's ideal was a society where everyone worked for the common good, but this meant a highly centralized state with totalitarian power. The strategy of communism, as implemented by Lenin, was built on force and control. The Russian Revolution didn't just shake up Russia, it spread revolutionary ideas across the globe. Communism, under Lenin, became a worldwide movement. He viewed the Soviet Union as a model for other nations to follow. However, the legacy of Lenin's communism is complicated. While he succeeded in creating the first communist state, it came at a significant cost. Lenin used violence to suppress political dissent, like during the Russian Civil War when an estimated 7 million people died. His successor, Joseph Stalin, took this a step further, implementing policies that led to even more brutal purges and famines. Chapter 3: The Social Safety Net. Socialism's middle path. Socialism, by contrast, is more about gradual change than violent revolution. Unlike communism, socialism accepts that capitalism can exist, but it focuses on limiting its negative effects. Socialism believes that a free market economy is fine as long as it doesn't create massive inequality. The core idea of socialism is that wealth and resources should be distributed more fairly. Think of it as a safety net for the poor and disadvantaged. This safety net often includes universal healthcare, public education, and social welfare programs. Countries like Canada, Denmark, and the UK have created systems where the government plays a significant role in ensuring everyone has access to basic needs. Sweden is often cited as a great example of socialism in action. The Scandinavian country combines a capitalist market economy with robust social welfare programs. High taxes fund things like free college education and universal healthcare. The result is a country with high living standards and low poverty rates. Unlike communism, socialism doesn't aim to abolish private ownership. In fact, businesses still operate in a capitalist system. But, they are often regulated by the government to ensure that they don't harm workers or the environment. Socialists believe that the government should step in when the market fails. If big corporations prioritize profits over people, it's the government's role to step in. For example, socialists support policies like minimum wage laws and labor protections to make sure workers aren't exploited. The difference in approach is clear. While communism wants to eliminate private property altogether, socialism simply wants to make sure the wealth generated from private businesses benefits everyone, not just the rich. This doesn't mean that socialism is without criticism. Some argue that large government control can stifle innovation and economic freedom. But the idea is to balance fairness with freedom, a concept many believe benefits society in the long run. Ultimately, socialism's focus on equality can be seen in policies that encourage wealth redistribution. For instance, socialists support progressive taxation, where the wealthy pay a higher percentage of their income in taxes. This creates more funds for public services and welfare programs that benefit society as a whole. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a deep dive into political systems that have shaped our world today. Chapter 4: Control or Choice: The Economy under Communism versus Socialism. When it comes to the economy, communism and socialism have stark differences. Communism is all about control. Under communist regimes, the state owns all means of production, factories, farms, and resources. There's no private property, no businesses running for profit. Everything is centrally planned by the government, which dictates what gets produced, in what quantity, and how goods are distributed. In practice, this means that communist economies often struggle with inefficiency. The lack of competition can lead to low productivity and scarcity. A good example of this is the Soviet Union. The USSR, for all its military and political might, faced constant shortages of consumer goods. In fact, for decades, Soviet citizens had to wait in long lines for basic products like bread and milk. The centralized planning system simply couldn't meet demand. On the other hand, socialism allows for more flexibility in the economy. While the government still plays a major role, especially in sectors like healthcare, education, and public transportation, private businesses can exist. These businesses must, however, operate under strict regulations aimed at ensuring they don't exploit workers or the environment. For example, in many European socialist countries, there's a strong push to ensure businesses provide fair wages and benefits, while also being responsible for their environmental impact. Sweden is a great example of a socialist economy. The government has nationalized certain industries, like energy and telecommunications, but private businesses still thrive. The key difference is that the state ensures there's a strong social safety net, so no one is left behind. Sweden has one of the highest standards of living in the world, with healthcare, education, and eldercare all covered by taxes. One criticism of socialist economies is the high tax rates, which are required to fund such social programs. For example, in Sweden, taxes can reach over 50% for high earners. However, this money goes directly into funding social services, and the overall poverty rate is among the lowest in the world. While communist regimes have struggled to achieve economic success, many socialist countries have found a way to balance economic growth with social justice. In the end, communism seeks to remove all private enterprise, while socialism allows for a balance between government control and free market activity. The real-world results of each system depend heavily on how well governments manage the economy and meet the needs of the people. Chapter 5: Democracy or Dictatorship. Political systems in practice. Another key difference between communism and socialism is how they approach politics and governance. Communism, at least in practice, often leads to dictatorship. Under Marx's original vision, the state would eventually wither away after the revolution. But in reality, communist countries have tended to be highly centralized, with leaders who hold absolute power. Take the Soviet Union, for example. After Lenin's death, Joseph Stalin rose to power and established one of the most authoritarian regimes in history. Stalin's policies led to the deaths of millions, both from purges and man-made famines. Political dissent was crushed, and the KGB, a secret police force, kept the population in fear. The idea of a classless society was replaced with an elite ruling class that controlled the government, military, and economy. This is a stark contrast to socialism, which often exists within democratic frameworks. In countries like Norway, Finland, and Denmark, socialism has flourished without sacrificing political freedom. These countries have a combination of free elections, strong political parties, and an open press, all while maintaining extensive social safety nets and wealth redistribution policies. Socialism allows for democratic participation. Citizens elect leaders who create policies that promote social welfare, but private property and individual freedoms are still protected. In fact, many socialist countries have some of the world's highest voter turnout rates. For example, voter turnout in Sweden regularly exceeds 80%, showing how engaged people are in the political process. In theory, communism and democracy don't mix. Marx believed that after the revolution, the state would become unnecessary, but this idea never materialized in practice. Instead, communist regimes like Cuba and North Korea have remained highly centralized and often suppress any form of dissent. These regimes justify their authoritarian nature by arguing that the revolutionary state is temporary. The difference in political structure is clear. Socialism allows for greater political freedom and a more democratic system, whereas communism often results in an authoritarian government. But it's important to note that not all socialist countries are purely democratic. For example, China, while technically a communist country, has shifted toward a more market-driven economy, but the political system remains authoritarian. Chapter 6, Beyond the Ideals, Communism and Socialism in the Modern World. While communism and socialism were born in the 19th and 20th centuries, their ideas are still relevant today. The world has seen countless experiments with both ideologies, with mixed results. For instance, Cuba's communist regime has been in power since 1959, surviving despite economic hardship and external pressures, particularly from the United States. While the Cuban government provides healthcare and education to its people, it's also criticized for political repression and limited personal freedoms. Meanwhile, many European countries have embraced socialism to varying degrees. The Nordic model is perhaps the best-known example of successful socialism. Countries like Denmark, Norway, and Sweden have built strong welfare states while maintaining capitalist economies. The result? High standards of living, low poverty rates, and strong economic growth. The success of these nations has sparked debates about whether the United States, for example, should adopt similar policies. Yet, socialism is not without its challenges. Critics argue that heavy taxation, necessary to fund extensive social programs, can stifle innovation and reduce the incentives for hard work. Furthermore, managing a large government bureaucracy can sometimes lead to inefficiency. That said, countries like Norway continue to perform well economically, showing that socialism doesn't always hinder progress. Some modern governments try to blend elements of both ideologies. China, for instance, has adopted many capitalist practices, with a booming private sector, while maintaining strict government control over politics and key industries. This hybrid model has allowed China to become an economic powerhouse, but it's also resulted in a political system that's far from democratic. In the United States, the debate between capitalism and socialism continues to grow. The growing wealth gap has led some politicians and activists to call for more socialist policies like universal healthcare, free college education, and a living wage. But many Americans fear that such policies would lead to higher taxes and more government control. In the end, both communism and socialism have left their mark on the modern world. Communism has often been tied to authoritarian regimes, while socialism has found more success in democratic contexts. Both systems seek to address inequality, but their methods differ greatly. And while they're often seen as opposites, many countries today are finding ways to blend elements of both to create more equitable societies. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for more videos breaking down political systems and their real-world impacts.